drawer boxes, one of the few moving parts in a kitchen. Today I'm going to walk you through how we build drawer boxes out of real lumber using pocket screws and grooving for the bottom panel. Let's get into it. Now in the description I'm going to outline and timestamp all of the steps that we're going to be doing, but starting with step 1, we're going to measure the height, width, and depth of the opening that we're making the drawer box for. This is important for the next step. Alrighty, let's dive into making the material list. I'm going to try and keep this super simple. So this is what looking at the top of the drawer box would look like. Okay, we have two rails, so this is the front and the back of the drawer box, the stiles, which are the left and right, and then the floating panel, which is in the middle, that basically goes into that groove all four directions. Okay, that's the bottom of the drawer box. Now when we're coming up with the material list, here's the easiest way to think about this. The height of the opening, you're going to subtract 1/2 inch from. The width of your drawer box is going to be 2.5 inches, assuming two things. One, you're using side mount drawer glides, which are going to be 1/2 inch and 1/2 inch. So that's 1 inch, right? And then you're using 3/4 plywood or 3/4 lumber to make your drawer box, okay? So then you have 3/4 and 3/4, which makes 1.5 inches, plus the side mount drawer glides, that's another inch. That would be 2.5 inches. So whatever this opening is, you're going to subtract 2.5, and that's going to give you the width of your rails, okay? So far we know that our rails, assuming, let's just, for numbers, let's say that the opening is 20 inches, okay? I'm going to subtract 2.5 from that. 20 minus 2 1/2 equals 17.5. Half by 4.5. By 4.5. I don't know what that is, but you get the idea. Okay, so we already know what our rails are. Look at that, we're like 30 seconds in. Well done. So two rails, these guys right here, at 17.5 by 4.5. Again, this works every way. So if this opening was only 10 inches, they'd be 7.5. If this rail was, if this opening was 19 inches, they would be 16.5. So on and so forth. You get the idea. And then the depth measurement of your drawer box is roughly going to be 1 inch subtracted from the front of the back of the cabinet to the front of the face frame. Another way to think of this is if you just think of it in standard numbers. Most cabinets, for instance, lower cabinets are 24 inches. You're going to subtract 1 inch from the inside of the cabinet or 2 inches from the total, and that's going to give you a 22-inch drawer box. Okay, because you also have hardware. For instance, for side mount drawer glides, you also have hardware that has to go back there to mount to the back of the cabinet. Okay, so let's say this would be roughly 23 inches on a standard lower cabinet. That gives us a 22-inch deep cabinet. So our stiles, we now know, are 23 minus 1 inch. Okay, 3 minus 1 inch would give us two stiles at 22 by 4.5. Boom. So we now have our material list for our rails and our stiles. We need two rails this wide and then two stiles this long. Both of them are the same height. Okay. The last measurement is our floating panel. Okay, now whenever it comes to this floating panel, there's two different ways to figure out the measurement for the floating panel. One is honestly probably the easiest. The downside is you have to trust me a little bit. Once you have these two measurements, you have your rail measurement and then your stile measurement, or your total width of your drawer box both ways, you just subtract 3/8 inch from the total depth of the cabinet. So from end of stile to end of stile, you subtract 3/8 inch, and then from end of style this way and end of style this way, you subtract 7/8 of an inch. And that is going to give you your floating panel measurement based off whatever size this drawer box needs to be. And that pretty much transcends whatever size your cabinet is. That math is going to stay true as long as you're building it the way that we are. I'm going to have to make another video explaining how that math plays out, but that is that is the way it plays out. The other thing is when you're making this, if you're not 100% certain that you're going to cut that floating panel exact, make those measurements a little bit smaller. Instead of subtracting 7/8, maybe subtract an inch to give yourself an extra eighth of an inch of play. And then on this one, instead of subtracting 3/8, maybe subtract half of an inch. Just so you have a little bit more to work with. Like I said, if you can't cut this floating panel exactly square, you will inevitably make the whole drawer box out of square, and then your drawer guides won't want to sit right, and your drawer won't open right, so on and so forth. You get the idea. Now, let's get into the shop and start planning down our material. Now that we have our material list, let's dive into the next step, which is planing our material. For this video, I am using 3/4 lumber. This particular project, we're going to be using birch. Pretty standard. If you're getting 13/16 material, you'll just take and run it through your planer and take a 32nd off of each side, and you'll be exactly 3/4 of an inch. Now, something I like to do once I have planed the material down is take it over to the table saw and rip it to height. But before I do all of my cross cuts, I like to take it to the sanding station and go ahead and sand it down to 180 grit. This gives me an opportunity to put the material under a light and really tell if there's like dents in the wood or concaves, something that we want to actually cut out and not use in the final piece. That's a great time for me to catch that. And then it also allows me to sand out any, let's say, diagonal lines or things that worn planer blades would have left before I go back and try and start getting really precise cuts. Now that everything is sanded, you can go over to your chop saw or whatever you're using to cut your cross cuts and cut everything down to size. You should cut out 4 pieces here, 2 rails and 2 stiles. Something I like to do if I have the setup for it is to line the boards up on top of each other and cut them exactly the same size. This way, if for whatever reason you're slightly big or slightly small, at least your material will all be exactly the same. For a visual here, this is 3/8 of an inch. This is how much material we want on the underside of the panel that will go inside of the rails and stiles. I like to use these little aluminum blocks for a gauge, but essentially we just put it at the bottom of the board, and then we'll put the blade up against that, as you just saw. We'll run it through. The blade height is going to be at 3/8 of an inch as well. What you'll notice is I'm cutting 5 pieces like this. 4 are for the actual drawer box, so 2 rails and 2 stiles, and then 1 as a template or a test piece that I can continuously move this blade on until I find the exact width of the 1/4 inch plywood that I'm putting as the bottom panel. As you see, I have done that, and now I can run them all through and then shift the blade over to cut out that middle that will be left after I'm done. Now, if you'll notice, I have raised the blade up and I'm going to cut off all of that excess material on the bottom of the back rail. The reason for that is so we can slide the floating panel in, and then also something to fasten to. Now's a good time to take all 4 pieces and dry fit them. Just kind of make sure that everything looks right. You should have 3 that are the same height and then 1 that is slightly shorter that will go in the back. Once everything looks good, we can take the 2 inside pieces, the rails, and take them over to pocket drill on the outside of both of them. I like to do 2 pocket screws on either side. Make sure that the groove is up. We are not putting the pocket screws on the inside of the drawer box, but on the outside. I like to set them essentially 1 inch from the top and bottom on both sides of the rails. This is what we're going to need to assemble. As we get ready to assemble our box, we need pocket screws, our drill, and a clamp. I like to clamp from the top, throw 2 screws in, rinse and repeat until we get our box assembled. Now this is where precision becomes really important, because you need these grooves to all line up with each other almost exact, because any discrepancy there will be seen in the finished product, because there will be a gap on one end or one corner of the drawer box, and obviously we don't want that. You can clamp sideways like I've done here to help solidify this back panel. Since you can't clamp from the top, this is one of my favorite ways to do this. Now that the box itself is assembled, we can go over to our table saw and cut out our bottom panel. Drum roll, please. Perfect. That's what we like to see. Next up, we'll take our tape measure and pull our diagonals and make sure that the box is perfectly square. This is important. Do not skimp on this. This will make installing the drawer box way easier or way harder. Now, when we're installing the bottom panel, I do like to use screws. You can use nails or staples, but considering that the entire drawer box so far has been assembled with screws, I like to put on the bottom panel with screws as well. In case you ever need to disassemble this box, it's pretty easy. We're at the home stretch. Now what I like to do is go over everything with 220 grit, and as you can see here, I'm using some of my bigger sanders, but you don't have to. You can hand sand this as well. I like to take the smaller sander, our SurfPrep 3x4 here, and sand and round over all of the edges. But I like to use my bigger sander to go ahead and sand everything perfectly flat so that the drawer box, all of the seams are perfectly level. Now with everything sanded, we can vacuum it and it's ready for clear coat. This is what it should look like. Voila. This is what birch looks like with clear coat, by the way. Gorgeous. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe, as we have videos like this coming out all the time. We'll see you in the next one.